Okay, let's just go with it. And I think I may have done this before. So one way to think about it is if you have two containers, and these two containers are connected. Don't worry about that. So just imagine that they're connected. I have the line there connecting them, but you don't see where the fluid in one can actually enter the other. So let's just say this is container A, this one's container B. And let's just say in container A we have 25% solution of some salt, 25% salt. And over here we have 35% salt. Now, let's just say they're connected, but there's a semi-permeable membrane between them that will allow some particles to move across and not others. First of all, let's pretend that that semi-permeable membrane is not there. So all particles on either side can move from one direction to the other. Okay? So if that were the case, in container A and container B, contents could move freely to either side. Which direction would the salt move? So we have 25% salt in A, 35% salt in B. So which direction would salt move? How many say from? So salt would move from B to A? How many say B to A? So y'all don't understand diffusion. Diffusion, no, just diffusion. We're going back to diffusion first, just so you all understand. So diffusion, define diffusion. Right, so movement of anything, any particle, from a high concentration of that particle to a low concentration of that particle. So salt, so if you have a solution of salt water, I guess you have to understand that first. If you have a solution of salt water, what is the solution? The solution has a what? A solute and a solvent. Right? You all remember that? So any solution has a solute and a solvent. So the solute is what's dissolved in the solvent. So solute is dissolved in solvent. So if we have a solution of salt water, salt would be the what? Solute. Water would be the solvent. So what you have here in container A is 25% salt, 75% what? Water. In the other container you have 35% salt. And how much water? 65% water. Okay? So now, if salt can move, if you understand diffusion, you know which way salt is going to move. Right? Salt is going to move from B to A. Right? Everybody with me? So diffusion is movement of any substance from high concentration of that substance to a low. So salt would move from B to A. Now, in our body, we have cell membranes that are semi-permeable. They're not going to allow salt to move. So that's why I put this imaginary semi-permeable membrane between the two containers to show that, okay, salt can't move, but water can move. And when water moves, water is going to move by osmosis, right? So diffusion of water is osmosis. That's simple, but like I said, you have to understand diffusion first. So if water can move, which way will water move? Okay, so this container has 75% water. So important to understand this going forward. And since there's 35% salt, there's 65% water in this container. Okay, so water moves which way? Water moves from container A to container B. Whereas we said salt moves from container B to container A. You get it? Everybody get it? Now, and you always hear that water follows salt. Now you know why. Because wherever salt is a higher concentration, water is a lower concentration. So it's really following salt, but the reason it's following salt is because water is just diffusing from where it has a higher concentration to where it has a lower concentration. Okay? Now, so when we think about osmolarity, all I want you all to do there, osmolarity has to do with the amount of solute in solution. So whenever you see something talking about osmolarity and it says one compartment has a higher osmolarity than the other, all you should think about is that osmolarity is referring to solute concentration. So if I increase the osmolarity in container B or A, let's just say we increase the osmolarity of container A, and it's going to depend on how much we increase it. If we increase it to 30%, it's still going to be a lower concentration than container B. So you're still going to have diffusion in the same direction, but it's not going to be, remember the steepness of a gradient, concentration gradient, the steepness of the gradient determines how fast the diffusion occurs. Not a big deal. But in thinking about osmolarity, okay, now let's go back to the slide here where it says that last bullet point, if imbalances arise, osmosis restores balance within seconds. If osmolarity of tissue fluid rises, water moves out of the cell. If osmolarity of the tissue rises, so what you should be thinking here is everything's balanced, right, between tissue fluid and cells. Let's look at the next slide first. Actually, I wanted to show you on this one. So when you look at this slide, what it's showing you is that water moves between these various compartments. And so kind of spend time looking at this and making sense of it. So we bring water into the body when we drink, correct? So drinking water ends up in our digestive tract, but it immediately is absorbed into the what? Into the bloodstream. So it goes into the bloodstream. Now, in the bloodstream, water circulates and the kidneys get rid of any excess. But what happens when the water gets in the bloodstream, some of that water can move into the interstitial fluid, the tissue fluid. Okay? Now, what we're talking about here is what determines if that water is going to move into the tissues or if fluid from the tissues is going to go into the bloodstream. So you can see water doesn't come from the blood into the digestive tract. Everything is showing you the direction that water can move. But water can move from the tissue fluid to the bloodstream and from the bloodstream to the tissue fluid. So you see the arrows telling you that. But what determines whether that water is going to move from the bloodstream to the tissue fluid? Osmolarity. So if blood has a higher osmolarity, are y'all with me? So just think about that. If blood has a higher osmolarity, if there's an increase in blood osmolarity, what do we say that means? There's an increase in solute concentration. So if you increase the solute concentration of water, of blood, what is going to happen to water? Is it going to come into the blood from the tissue, or is it going to leave the blood and go to the tissues? Think about that for a moment. So so we have blood osmolarity and tissue osmolarity the same, balanced. Now there's all of a sudden an increase in blood osmolarity. Let's just say you just had some turnip greens and had a bunch of salt on it. So now coming into your bloodstream, you have water, but you also have that salt. So the salt is going to do what to blood osmolarity? Increase blood osmolarity. So by increasing blood osmolarity, you now have a higher concentration of salt in your blood. And that's going to cause fluid to move in which direction, looking at tissue fluid and blood. So remember, wherever there's a higher salt concentration, there's a lower water concentration, right? So by increasing the osmolarity of blood, so basically what you have is this situation we just mentioned. So what we've done is made blood like B. So if you think of A as the tissue and B as the bloodstream, we've increased the osmolarity in the blood. So the salt concentration is now higher in the blood than it is in the tissue, which is represented by A. So water is going to leave what? The blood, right? No, I'm sorry. Water is going to leave the tissue and go to the blood. So just remember, wherever salt concentration increases, water is going in that direction. Okay? That may be easier for you all to. Yeah. So whenever you increase salt concentration, water, if you remember, water follows salt. Water is going to move in the direction where there's a higher salt concentration. So by eating all the salt on your greens, you're increasing the osmolarity of your blood. So that's going to attract more what? Water from the tissues. Exactly. So osmolarity is what determines the movement of water by osmosis. Okay? So there, if that was the case, and remember we talked a little bit about this with, why is a person who has hypertension told to reduce their salt intake? Because of this. Right? So if your blood pressure is already high, consuming salt makes your blood osmolarity go up, and that's going to draw more water into your bloodstream, increasing blood volume, which automatically increases what? Blood pressure. Okay? Y'all see that? So I wanted you all to understand osmolarity. Again, osmolarity has to do with the amount of solute dissolved in solution. Okay, so fluid moves between interstitial fluid and the bloodstream. And once interstitial fluid, we get into the tissues, some of that fluid outside of the cell can go into the cell. Okay, so there's that. They're balanced for the most part, but there's some movement of fluid between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. And so also the fluid that's in the interstitial fluid can go into the what? Lymphatic. So remember we said the lymphatic system samples a bit of the tissue fluid and then sends all that fluid back where? To the bloodstream. Okay? So look at this picture a few times so you understand where water moves between those various compartments. From where? No, fluid can move from the tissues as well. So from the tissues into the bloodstream. So either way, depending on changes in osmolarity. Okay? And there are different things too. We don't really get into it that much. But there are proteins in the blood that contribute to osmolarity, as well as in the tissue fluid. So those also play a role, but the key is understanding the osmolarity part of it. Okay. Any questions on that? So now I wanted you all to see if you could understand that question. If osmolarity of the tissue fluid rises, think about that. Osmolarity of the tissue fluid. So in the picture, that's the picture in the middle. So you have all those cells, and outside of the cells, it's saying the tissue fluid osmolarity increases. Water is going to move out of the cell. Does that make sense to you? So by increasing the osmolarity of tissue fluid, remember, wherever osmolarity increases, water is coming to that area. Okay? So by the fluid osmolarity increasing, water is going to move from the intracellular space to the extracellular space. That also has to do with tonicity. Remember hypertonic? If you put a cell in a hypertonic environment, fluid will leave the cell. It's all the same. Same thing. Okay? So if tissue fluid osmolarity falls, water will move into the cells. Osmosis from one fluid compartment to another is determined by the relative concentration of solutes in each compartment. So you all remember what solutes are. They're the component dissolved in solvent. Electrolytes are the most abundant solute particles. Sodium salts are predominant in the extracellular fluid, and those you should know for the test. So which electrolyte, I may ask on the test, is more predominant extracellularly and which is more predominant intracellularly. So sodium is more predominant in the extracellular fluid. Potassium has a higher concentration inside the cell. You all may remember that from the neurons. Remember the nervous system? Ooh, that was a long time ago. So action potential. Remember, sodium gates open and sodium rushes in because there's a higher concentration outside of the cell. Okay. Electrolytes play the principal role in governing the body's water distribution and total water content. So that's why it's so important for our electrolytes to be balanced. Now, let me ask you all something. You all heard of water intoxication? What is that? So you drink too much water too rapidly and you can be drunk or you can die. And I think on the integrity session you may have, I talked about a contest, a radio contest, where I think the person who could drink the most water in their radio studio would win a PlayStation or something. This was back when everybody was rushing to buy PlayStations and they were running out. And a young lady won, but she passed away because she had too much water to drink in a short amount of time. Think about what's going on there. Let's look at those compartments again. And she complained of being dizzy. I guess that's the drunk part. So looking at this, what happens? So she's drinking the water, the picture on the left. All the water goes. Right, so most of the water, not all, some of it continues through. But most of the water is absorbed into the bloodstream. Now where does it go? So now the osmolarity, blood osmolarity is doing what? So if you're bringing in so much water, that's diluting blood, right? So the osmolarity of blood is doing what? Going down. So blood osmolarity goes down. And now where does that fluid go? The water go? To the tissues. And think about tissues that may have a problem with bringing all that water in. That can happen as well. But before that, you end up, think of your brain. So you have too much fluid. Your brain is a tissue, right? So she first complained of a headache, headache, dizziness. So what's happening is all of that water, excess water, is coming into brain tissue. So the brain is doing what? Swelling. Okay? And there's nowhere for the brain to, the skull is in the way, so the brain obviously can't swell like your arm could. Your arm could continue swelling for a longer time than your brain could. So, in a short amount of time, that's exactly what happens. Now, usually it's really hard almost to drink too much water. It's probably just drinking a gallon and just non-stop, because our kidneys work pretty fast, right? So usually if you're drinking a lot of water, you're also what? Running to the restroom because your kidneys are getting rid of the excess water. But in that case, she was drinking too much too rapidly and passed away, unfortunately. So that is called water intoxication. I'm not sure what her build was, but I'm sure there may be, depending on the build or the size, that may influence how much it would take. But for all of us, there is going to be that maximum. And also, obviously, if a person's kidneys are not working properly, it would probably happen. And why are they doing that? And that's another good point.
It's a drug test in my life. But what I'm saying is that a lot of people are always at the water fountain whenever you sit in the room and I work for several companies and water's not but
yeah, it would take a lot. It would take a lot. I think you get tired of drinking it before it would get to that point. Okay. Sensible. So this is you all can go through these. This is not all that difficult. Let's see. I'm just going to jump to some of the more challenging parts here. Dehydration. All right. So what is dehydration? So that's loss of fluid, body fluid, right? And so it reduces. So how can you think and make sense of why dehydration would reduce blood volume and blood pressure? So think of what blood is mostly. Blood is mostly what? Water. So if you're decreasing the amount of water in blood, you're decreasing the amount of blood that you have. So dehydration is going to reduce blood volume. And remember we said the relationship between blood volume and blood pressure is what? Right. So they're directly proportional. By increasing blood volume, blood pressure automatically decreases. Okay. By increasing blood volume, blood pressure increases. So they go in the same direction, in other words. And does that make sense to you? Like I said, instead of memorizing definition, make it make sense to you, because you'll never forget if it makes sense to you. So how does reducing blood volume also reduce blood pressure? Exactly. So the way we define blood pressure is what? The force of blood against the wall of the vessel. So if there's less blood, there's less force. Okay? And on the opposite end, so if you increase blood volume by consuming too much salt, so hopefully that makes sense to you. Consuming excess salt brings in more fluid. That's increasing blood what? Volume, which is also increasing blood pressure. Okay? And we have osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. And those osmoreceptors respond to changes in osmolarity. So they're going to respond to angiotensin II, which is produced whenever blood pressure drops. And so all of this is basically there's always a concern when blood pressure drops too low. There is some concern when blood pressure goes up, but blood pressure dropping is a much more immediate danger to the body. So there's, when you go through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, all of that is a mechanism to make sure that blood volume stays where it should so that blood pressure can be maintained. What is the danger of low blood pressure? Just if you think about it. Blood pressure being too low is affecting what? So if your blood pressure is too low, let's just say a person's hemorrhaging, losing too much blood pressure is too low, there's not enough blood getting to the tissues, right? So remember, we need blood flow to get oxygen to the brain, glucose to the brain. So have you ever seen a water hose and water squirts out really far, and then sometimes it just goes out slowly? So that's low pressure. So if you just imagine that in your blood vessels, blood is not really moving to the tissues the way it should. So the tissues are not being perfused and not receiving enough oxygen and glucose. So there's a great danger to dehydration and reduced blood volume for that purpose. That leads to what's called circulatory shock, where the tissues are just not getting adequate blood flow. So that's what all this has to do with. And there was something else I said. So the way the body responds. So the body responds by all these mechanisms to try to increase blood volume. Remember ADH? Antidiuretic hormone. What does it do? Right, so it decreases urine output, right, for the purpose of increasing blood volume or preventing blood volume from decreasing any further. Okay. Another thing the body does in that situation, I just wanted to mention here, is whenever blood volume drops too low, one sign of that is the heart rate will start to increase. So let's go back to here for 1 second, because students sometimes get confused here. So what we said was that if your heart rate increases, for example, when you're exercising, increase in heart rate also increases blood pressure, right? That's another relationship you all should know. So when your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases. Now, if your blood pressure decreases dramatically, one of the homeostatic mechanisms in place is for the heart to beat faster. Okay, that's in response to low blood pressure. So you do have the relationship between heart rate increasing, causing blood pressure to increase. But if your blood pressure drops considerably low, one mechanism, compensatory mechanism that the body has is to speed up the heart rate so that the blood pressure increases. So the key is making sure heart rate stays, blood pressure stays elevated, so cardiac output is fairly continuous. Okay. And now let me spin in. There's information here that you all should go through. Okay, sodium is reabsorbed or excreted. Water follows. ADH. Fluid deficiency. So fluid deficiency is hypovolemia, one of those terms. So blood volume is too low. And one thing, know the difference between dehydration versus hemorrhaging. So in both cases, blood volume is decreasing, right? So if a person is dehydrated, they're losing water. If they're hemorrhaging, they're losing total blood. So if a person is dehydrated, what's happening to the blood osmolarity? Think about that. So if you have your total blood, you have the dissolved solutes, and now you're just pulling water out of it. Does that make blood more concentrated? Y'all see the point there? So if you're just pulling water out of blood, all the solutes stay there. So it becomes more concentrated. So that means osmolarity is increasing if you're just pulling water out. Right? Because osmolarity has to do with the ratio, sort of solute to solvent. So that ratio is changing when you're just pulling water out. Versus if you just lose blood. If you're losing whole blood, you're losing as much water as you are solutes. So the osmolarity doesn't change in that situation. Alright, let me jump on to, I think the rest of this you all should be able to get. Just let me know if you have questions on them. The electrolytes, some of these we mentioned. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on acids and bases. Natriuretic peptide. Remember that? ANP. Where does that come from? Good. From the heart. And what does it do? Good. So natriuretic. Think of diuretic. So a diuretic causes you to what? Eliminate water. A natriuretic causes you to eliminate sodium. Okay? So if you are eliminating sodium, so the kidneys are getting rid of excess sodium that's in the blood. That's what the ANP does. It inhibits sodium and water reabsorption. What does that mean? So in the kidneys, right, so as blood flows, is filtered through the kidneys, all of these mechanisms are going to control whether the kidneys gets rid of the sodium and water or brings it back into the body. So if the body needs it, the kidneys get the signal to bring it back into the bloodstream. So that's what reabsorption means. So what ANP does is inhibits the kidneys from bringing sodium and water back into the body So the body eliminates those. And what does that do to blood pressure? Exactly. Okay, so try to connect the dots. And this is when you all get to nursing. This is what hurts a lot of people, fluid electrolyte balance. So try to at least make sense of this before you get to that point. Okay, secretion of renin and ADH are also involved there. There's also something called caliuretic with a K. Did y'all see that one? I think I may have that somewhere. A caliuretic is going to release potassium. K. It has a K from the body. The kidneys releasing potassium. Okay, hypernatremia. So you all should have an idea just by looking at those what the words mean. Hypernatremia is a condition where what? Blood calcium is too high. Hyponatremia, blood calcium. Did I say calcium? I meant sodium. So hypernatremia, the Na refers to sodium. Too much sodium. Hyponatremia, too little sodium. And there's that word hyperkalemia and hypokalemia. Too much potassium, too little potassium. So those conditions can be very dangerous, as you all will see. Alright, let's jump into acid bases. Okay, so one of the most important aspects of homeostasis involves balancing acids and bases. Metabolism depends on enzymes, and enzymes are sensitive to pH. So when we say that blood pH is what? Between what? Great. So 7.35 to 7.45. Any shift too far below, and really it's just slightly below or above those values, can be fatal. So, and what is actually the problem? So if blood is, for example, or tissues are too acidic or too basic, what happens is all of our cells have enzymes working within the cell. So if you stop the enzymes from working, the cells die. So by having the pH out of range, those cells are no longer able to function because the enzymes stop working. And that's with temperature as well. So temperature and pH have to be maintained because our cells can only function when they are in a very narrow range. Slight deviation from the normal pH can shut down the entire metabolic pathways. Slight deviation from normal can also alter the structure and function of proteins, the macromolecules within the cells that make up the cells. And temperature is the same, so that's why body temperature has to stay very close to 98.6 degrees, because any shift is going to have an adverse effect on the proteins and enzymes. Okay, so 7.35 to 7.45 is the normal pH range of blood as well as tissue fluid. We know that the stomach is not in that range, right? The pH of the stomach is where? Right, so very low, even less than 1. So the environment there must be very different. So 7.35 to 7.45, but look what it says, 3/10 of a point shift in either direction is fatal. That's not a whole lot, is it? So that would mean what? So what pH would you say is fatal then? 3/10 of a point? Like 7 point what? 0? 7.0, would that be fatal? So if the blood pH dropped to 7.0 or increased to 7.75, so the body then has to do a constant job of making sure the pH doesn't fall out of that range. Okay, so challenges to acid-base balance. Metabolism constantly produces acid. So we're constantly producing lactic acid, the process of making ATP. Remember, anaerobic fermentation, when your muscles fatigue, that lactic acid build up. So the body has to be able to get rid of that fairly quickly. Phosphoric acid from breakdown of nucleic acid, fatty acid and ketones from breakdown of fats. And this is what happens in individuals who have diabetes mellitus. So the problem is their blood's glucose is too high. So that means the body cells are not getting glucose, so those cells have to start breaking down fatty acids instead, breaking down fats. And so what that does is causes an accumulation of ketones, which makes the blood too acidic. Carbonic acid from carbon dioxide. So remember, CO2 comes from the body cells as well. When the cells make ATP the normal way, by aerobic respiration, remember that carbon dioxide is produced, and that carbon dioxide has to be sent to the lungs for us to get it out of the blood. And so if there's any holdup, such as holding your breath, if you're holding your breath, you're keeping that CO2 in your blood, and the pH can become too low, too acidic. Okay? Now let's think of hyperventilation. Think about what that is. So we know hyperventilation means a person is doing what? Breathing rapidly. So if a person is breathing rapidly, they're blowing off too much CO2 too quickly. So the blood pH can become what? If you're getting rid of the CO2, basic. Okay? And remember, basic pHs are higher. Okay? Remember, acids are low pH. Right? Below 7 is acidic. Above 7 is basic. So our blood is slightly basic because it's above 7.0. So if a person is hypoventilating, what can that do to blood acidity, blood pH? So that would make it too low, which would make it acidic. Okay, so that would result in acidosis. So whenever there's a buildup of acid in the blood becomes acidic, and that results in acidosis. Now, okay, now think about this. This is what I want you all to kind of follow me on. So a person is diabetic. They don't know they're diabetic. But what happens is they go to the emergency room. They're breathing very rapidly. And the physician may notice that their blood sugar level is very high. So what does that tell them? So what we said before is that if a person is not, if their blood glucose is too high, and that's where you kind of have to understand everything, because if you just understand bits and pieces, it doesn't make sense. So if your blood glucose level is too high, that means glucose is not doing what? Going into your cells, right? Glucose is not making it into your body cells. Insulin, what does insulin do? Very good. You all remember that? So what insulin is actually doing, it's released, and what it does is tells the cells to open up and let glucose come in. Okay? Now, if insulin is not there, the cells are not going to let glucose in. Right? So now those cells still need to make ATP. So instead of ATP being made from glucose, ATP is going to be made from fatty acids. Okay, and this is why sometimes people lose weight when they are first diagnosed with diabetes mellitus. So your body starts to break down fatty acids, and the body is releasing CO2, but it's also releasing another acid. Okay, ketones, keto acids. Okay, so keto acids are filling up the bloodstream, and they're making the blood pH what? Those keto acids are going to make the blood acidic. So the pH of blood is doing what? It's going down. Okay? We have built-in mechanisms to try to get the blood pH back up. One of those is to make you breathe more rapidly. So I actually saw this once. So I took my son to the doctor, and another kid was in there. And he's just sitting there but breathing, just rapidly breathing. And they had to call an ambulance to come get him and take him to emergency. And I asked the nurse, and of course she couldn't tell me what was going on. But what happens is the body tries to recover the pH, bring the pH up by hyperventilating, by causing the person to hyperventilate. So hyperventilating is not getting rid of the ketones, but it's getting rid of the what? CO2, which is still going to help to some degree, but you also have buffers there, but eventually the buffers get all used up, so the pH is just going to start shooting up. So the body, one of the mechanisms that the body uses to respond to that decrease in pH is to make you breathe more rapidly, to blow off excess CO2, which still will increase the pH, but you still haven't fixed the problem if the problem is not CO2. It's going to work temporarily, but you have to fix what's actually causing the pH to drop. Okay? So the ketones, keto acids, that's it. Okay. Now, so the way the body responds to acids and bases is discussed here. So first I want you all to understand what acids are. So what is an acid? And then I'll let you all go. I know we're over. That's the other thing I wanted to put up here. So an acid, anybody know what an acid is? Okay. So acids are defined as chemicals that release hydrogen ions in solution. Okay, so a substance is acidic hydrogen ions into solution. And that's just words to you all. But think of it this way. So if I have something that I'm calling an acid, how do I know it's an acid? Because if I dump that in water, so water is H2O obviously, what's going to happen is that there's going to be an accumulation of hydrogen ions. So acids produce hydrogen ions in solution. Okay? Hydrochloric acid. So if you were to drink hydrochloric acid, you probably wouldn't be around very long. Because what it's doing is releasing these into your bloodstream. Okay? So if you have, so what we should have is an equal number of hydrogen ions, fairly equal. If you have an equal number of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, the pH is going to be 7.0. So with blood, it's going to be slightly basic. But whenever hydroxide ions equal hydrogen ions, that's when the pH is 7.0. So that's neutral pH. So anytime you have an overabundant number of hydrogen ions, you have a situation where your blood is too what? Too acidic, right? So pH. So remember, acids make the pH what? Low. Okay? Know any acids? Hydrochloric we just mentioned, so HCl. And basically all that's happening here, hydrochloric acid, you actually have hydrogens released in solution, but you also have chloride ions. So basically the H and the Cl just separate. But it's the hydrogens that are contributed to the pH. Chloride doesn't contribute to the pH. Just the hydrogen ions. Okay? Now, and is it clear that OH and H make water? So pure water doesn't conduct electricity because the hydrogens and ions are equal, so they're just going to form a connection with each other. What about a base? So acids, what do we say? Acids release hydrogen ions into the solution. Actually, it's going to be the same number of hydrogen ions as chloride, right? They just split apart. But it's the hydrogens that make any solution acidic. And bases, what'd you find for base? Okay. So you kind of have two definitions for a base. Any chemical that when dumped in water, it will accept hydrogen ions, or it will increase the number of hydroxide ions. So one base that you all may be familiar with, sodium hydroxide. That's what they have in perms that you put in your hair. That's why it's called base. It'll be called base. So sodium hydroxide, when it's dissolved in water, it's going to release hydrogen ions. It's going to be sodiums too, but sodiums don't contribute to the pH. Okay, so this buildup of hydroxides tell you that this solution must be basic. Now, because you have all those freely floating hydroxide ions, hydroxide binds with hydrogen ion to form water. So that's why the definition says it accepts hydroxide ions. Because if you have a free hydrogen ions, if you have a free hydroxide, it's going to form a bond with that hydrogen there. So it's going to take the hydrogen out of solution. Okay? Now, so there's only a problem. So if we think in terms of our blood pH or tissue fluid pH, we are fine as long as hydrogen is connected to something else. Okay? If hydrogens are just floating around freely like that, they're contributing to the acidity of the blood. But if you connect a hydrogen with the hydroxide or anything else, that hydrogen now is not influencing the pH. Okay, so that's how buffers work. You'll hear about buffers. I don't really have time to go through it, but you know that buffers do what in general? So buffers resist pH changes. So if we dump hydrochloric acid into our blood, the pH is going to fall very rapidly. Okay? Because there's going to be too much what? Too many hydrogen ions, and that's going to make the blood too acidic. If we drink sodium hydroxide, same thing. So too much sodium hydroxide is going to get into the blood, the hydroxide ions build up. Anytime you have more hydroxides than you have hydrogen ions, the blood becomes too what? Too basic. So really all we're looking at is a balance between hydroxide and hydrogen ions in the blood. If there's any shift in either way, either direction, then you're going to have an issue. So what buffers do, so our body has buffers that resist the changes of pH. Okay? So when you introduce these hydrogen ions to your blood, what buffers do is soak them up. Okay? So instead of the hydrogen ion here being free, now it's going to bind to a buffer. So as long as the hydrogen ion is not free, again, it's not contributing to the pH. Okay? And that's what buffers do. If I go back to the slide here, let's see. These are the buffers: bicarbonate, phosphate, and protein buffers. So again, all they do is connect either the hydrogen or hydroxide, depending on the situation. Yeah. And at this point, you all don't really need to memorize all this, but it explains if you have, so here you have a free hydrogen ion, and it's going to connect with a bicarbonate ion to make carbonic acid. So as long as you're sucking that hydroxide ion out of solution, it's not going to contribute to the pH. Okay.